Okay, we are in New Testament survey. We're in the book of Hebrews. We have looked over the first four chapters. We ended right around chapter 4, verse 14. What we're taking note of is that all the way through the book of Hebrews, the Apostle Paul, and I think he is the writer, and I thought Jerry gave some excellent points last week, which might not be a bad idea to look at today before we start. Turn to Hebrews 13, 23, 24. We were taught in school that Paul probably wrote the book. I think that's it. Notice Hebrews 13, 23, 24. Know ye that our brother Timothy is set at liberty. He's no longer in prison. With whom, if he comes shortly, I will see you. I will see you with him. Salute all them that have the rule over you, all the saints. They of Italy salute you. So here the Apostle Paul feels like he will see them again. Now, I'm not sure the exact timing on things, and I'm not sure about the imprisonment or anything like that. But you would have somewhere around 64, 65, 66, 67 AD, right in that time frame, no matter what. And again, I think it would be the Apostle Paul. Timothy is his sign of faith. As you're looking at a particular outline, we are taking note of chapter 1 to chapter 10, and we are seeing Christ is superior. Christianity is better than the Old Testament economy. Well, Christianity is better than anything, but in this case, Paul is writing to the Jews at Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and that area, and he's letting them know, as well as other Jews throughout the world, but the letter is to the Hebrews, mainly at Jerusalem, because that's where most of them are. And so he's pointing out that God in the Old Testament has made it clear that Christ is superior to anything that they hold value. For instance, in chapter 1, he pointed out that Christ is superior to the prophets. Then number 2, he pointed out in Hebrews 1, verse 4 through chapter 2, all of the chapters, that Christ is superior to the angels. And then in chapter 3, he pointed out that Christ is superior to Moses. Now, you take that in mind. All the prophets, all the angels, even Moses, the lawgiver, and Christ is superior to them. Yeah, well, that's a tremendous assertion. He didn't assert it. He proved it. He proved it in Scripture. Now, when we got to chapter 1 into chapter 2, he gave a danger signal. Chapter 2, 1 through 4. You may remember he had discussed the superiority of the prophets, superiority of the angels. And in the middle of that, he stopped and he gave a warning. So it was a warning of a danger of drifting. And then he did the same thing in Hebrews chapter 3, verse 7. He gave another warning, the danger of doubting. And here you take Moses brought the children of Israel out of Egyptian bondage. They're going through the wilderness, and they doubted. Well, Paul said, don't make that same mistake they did. The danger of doubting. We're now looking at chapter 4, verse 14. I think it takes up a new basic point. Christ is superior to the Levitical priesthood. Now that is superior to all the others. We pointed out that he gave 2 danger signals. In the middle of chapter 4:14 through chapter 7:28, he gives 2 danger signals. And so we're going to be looking at those this morning. Notice in chapter 4, verse 14, our high priest. And I want you to notice the language and see if it jumps out at you. Having been a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. Now, right now, I wish we were live and I could ask you face to face, What stood out to you in that assertion, in that proclamation, in that declaration? David, since you're closest to the microphone and your microphone is on, then maybe you can, maybe your thought is the same as my thought. Having been a great high priest, what stands out to you in that language? Verse 14.
I mean, I would be thinking he's not of the tribe of Levi as far as an original recipient's receiving of that statement.
Yeah, but if you didn't know anything about the tribe of Levi, and I do understand, and that is brought out repeatedly in the following chapters to show the superiority of his priesthood over Levi. But just in the wording itself, if you were a Gentile, never read the Bible, what would stand out to you? May not be the same thing as me, wonder, but he's from heaven. That would certainly stand out. Okay, I guess it's too general. Here's what stood out to me when I read that. Having been a great high priest. Now, the opportunities and the privileges and benefits we have today, you can take an electronic machine and you can read the entire Old Testament and New Testament, over 3 million letters, and you can get every place where great high priest is found. This is it. There's no other place. So it just jumped off the page at me after reading it for the last 60 years. It finally jumped off the page. Anyway, we continue on verse 15. For we have not, having a high priest, the great high priest, we have not a high priest that cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, the one that has been in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. I do see that what Paul has said is that Jesus Christ was tempted. Well, you can't tempt God. God doesn't sin. Well, while he was on the earth, in chapter 2, he took upon him flesh and blood, like all men. He could be tempted, and in Matthew chapter 4, he was tempted. Tempted in the same manner as we human beings are tempted, yet without sin. Name another human being that's like that. Name another human being that is without sin. From the standpoint of the age of accountability, from the standpoint of the mindset or the mind capability of an individual. Verse 16, since that's so, let us therefore draw near with boldness under the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy, may find grace to help us in time of need. I cannot tell you how great that whole section is when you look at it from the standpoint of the totality of human beings and how they look at their priests and how they look at their life and how they look at their God. The fact is, you cannot go to God, small g. But God, the Almighty, the Creator of all, has made it possible for us to come to God, not only address God, not only have access, Ephesians chapter 2, but with boldness, not with arrogance, but we can boldly, because of what he's done, stand before the throne of God and plead for mercy and grace. We're now in chapter 5, verse 1. So he's now introduced the idea of the priesthood of Christ. And as David has aptly pointed out, the one thing that would jump out for you is the fact that, wait a minute, I don't think that's going to work, because if we remember right, Jesus is the tribe of Judah. He cannot be a priest, much less a high priest. So Paul addresses, for every high priest being taken from among men is appointed for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices to God. So we have priests, we have high priests from the standpoint of the Jews and what they brought out. The priests are there so that you can come to God. The priests are there. You cannot address God without the priest. You have to have a mediator in the Old Testament time. Verse 2. Who can bear gently with the ignorant and erring, for that he himself also is compassed, is surrounded, is circled with infirmity. And by reason thereof is bound, as for the people, so also for himself, to offer for sin. Now, what I'm going to do is read a different version, Young's Literal Translation. I think it's just a little bit clearer. I think when you look and look and look, you can figure out what it said in the King James and American Standard. But I do think Young's Literal does a good job. Chapter 5, verse 3. Because of this infirmity, he ought, as for the people, so also for himself to offer for sin. So the priest of God under the old economy had to do what? He had to offer sacrifice for his own sin, as well as for the people. So what Paul is doing is bringing out the priesthood of the old time. Now he's going to go and tell us some things concerning the new priesthood of Jesus Christ. Well, we take it in verse 4 as well. No man taketh the honor unto himself, for when he is called of God, even as Aaron. So he was divinely called for a specific office and a specific work, and he was appointed as priest of God. By the way, Aaron is the brother of Moses. Verse 5. So Christ also glorified not himself, to be made a high priest, but he that spake unto him, Thou art my son, this day thou have begotten thee, as he saith also in another place, Thou art a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. What I would like for you to do is to circle verse 6 in your mind. That is one of the most outstanding statements in all of the Bible. There are a variety of reasons, but within this statement, there is tremendous evidence for Christianity. There is tremendous evidence for God. This is a prediction, and this prediction is absolutely magnificent. Read it again. Thou art a priest forever. We're going to come back to that, but I want you to think on it before we get to chapter 7. And this priesthood is after the order of Melchizedek. I'm going to try to articulate how great that statement is, because Paul uses it to make a point. He has made a proclamation. He hasn't proven it necessarily. He will prove it. By the way, 7, 8, and 9, verses 7, 8, and 9, are a passage dealing with salvation through Jesus Christ. He became the author of eternal salvation to all them that obey him. So we must obey Christ, or else we will be lost. Looking at verse 10. Named of God, a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. That's twice. Now, if you would, I'm just going to read it. You can write it down in your notes. Chapter 5, verse 6. Chapter 5, verse 10. Hebrews 6, verse 20. Having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Chapter 7, verse 11 is another key passage in this Melchizedek priesthood. Chapter 7, 11. Now, if there was perfection through the Levitical priesthood, or under it, after people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should arise after the order of Melchizedek? and not be reckoned after the order of Aaron. I cannot tell you. I will try to tell you later when we get to chapter 7. But that is a magnificent, magnificent point. And all of these things are wrapped around, thou art a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Chapter 7, verse 17, he says it again. So keep it in mind, the arrangement of God concerning Jesus Christ as priest is after the arrangement of Melchizedek. Now, what we're going to do, we're going to leave the idea of Christ being priest and the priest. We're going to turn our attention to the warnings that Paul gives based upon what he's already said. Now, what he's already said, there are good details, but there are more details coming. But he wants to warn the people first. So in chapter 5, verse 11, we read, it's the danger of dull hearing, of whom we have many things to say, Melchizedek, his priesthood, and hard of interpretation, seeing you are dull of hearing. I've told you about Glenn Clarn. Glenn Clarn says, Ron, whenever people say to you, I don't understand it that way. I did not know that. Mark it down. They didn't understand it and they didn't know. All they're saying, some people don't know and don't understand because they are dull of hearing. For when by reason of time, ye Christians ought to be teachers, you have need again that someone teach you the rudiments and first principles, the oracles of God. But become such as have need of milk and not solid food. You cannot eat the deeper things of God for solid food. He's using an analogy concerning food. You're still a baby. You have to drink milk. You cannot eat solid food. Looking at verse 13, for everyone that partaketh of milk is without experience of the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. But solid food is for full-grown men, even those who watch, who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern good and evil. Well, I don't see it that way. Well, the reason you don't see it that way is because you're not exercising your senses to discern good and evil as is given within the scriptures. And that sometimes is a lifetime of exercise. But there has to be a going on from the rudiments of first principles. There has to be a going on the eating of the solid food. So he gives them that warning. You need to quit being dull of hearing. He goes to the second warning, chapter 6. The danger of departing. We've heard of the religious teaching that once saved, always saved. The perseverance of the saints. It's a false doctrine. Now, reading verse 1. Reading verse 1. Wherefore, leaving the doctrine of the first principles of Christ, let us press on to perfection, not laying again the foundation of repentance and dead work, and of faith toward God, of teaching of baptism, of laying on of hands, and the resurrection of the dead, of the eternal judgment. So let's read those things. We got those things down. Let's go a little bit further, he says. This will we do if God permit. For as, verse 4, as touching those who were once enlightened, tasted of the heavenly gift, were made partakers of the Holy Spirit. It is my judgment, the partakers of the Holy Spirit would be those who could perform miraculous gifts in the first century. They tasted in that way. Could be a different way, but that's the way I look at it. And the powers of the age to come then fell away. King James says, if they fall away, there is no if. There is no if. Those who believe in once saved, always saved, will run to the King James and they'll point out that the King James is right. No, the King James is wrong. Now, the King James is not wrong because they tried to please King James. That's what I heard when I was a young man. The King James is wrong is because they followed two previous translations before them, the Kindle and another one. And both of those use if. If is not in the text. It is having fallen away. It is true indeed, one can fall, can apostatize from the truth, from Christianity. And then fell away, it is impossible to renew them again unto repentance. Seeing, this is why it's impossible. Seeing they crucified themselves, the Son of God praise, and put him to an open shame. The reason you cannot get such an apostate back is because he recognized that Christ died for his sins on the cross of Calvary, gave himself in such a way. He recognized the Holy Spirit would give the supernaturally gifted words of God, and these men who were performing miracles, he even participated in some of that, and then he fell away. What are you going to get him with? What are you going to tell him? Well, Christ died for you. I know it, don't care. Well, the supernatural gifts were in Christianity, not in other things. I know it and don't care. What are you going to tell him? No wonder it's impossible to bring a man back. After all, the way to get a man out of sin to begin with is through the gospel. When that man comes into the gospel, through the gospel, by the gospel, and then turns his back on the gospel, you can't get him back. And it's hard. It may not always stay one way. He goes on to point out some illustrations that illustrate the particular person is lost, but what you see in verse 4, 5, and 6 is this, a warning. Looking at verse 13, for when God made promise to Abraham, verse 15, and thus having patiently endured, he obtained the promise. Encouragement. Warning, encouragement. How does that apply to the Jews in Jerusalem who are their nation's fixing to fall, and they're having a terrible time? Even the Jews are having a terrible time, but especially the Christians are having a terrible time in Judaism, in Judea, in Jerusalem. Look at Abraham. He held on. He held on. He didn't have the promises that we did. Very encouraging. A lot more that's said in that particular text. We have to return back to the main thought of what was presented. Remember what we've just done, what we have tried to do is bring out the two warnings of danger. Now we go back to the main issue, chapter 7. He returns to the priesthood of Christ, and he wants to deal with some vitally important details concerning the priesthood of Christ. It goes like this. Christ is indeed our high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. That's what he wants us to know. So, looking at verse 1, why is the priesthood of Melchizedek superior to the Levitical priesthood? He's got to make that point before you go any further. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of God Most High, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the king and blessed him. Please look up. Don't read anymore. In other words, I would like your attention. Melchizedek blessed Abraham. Who is Abraham? He's the father of the Jewish nation. There is none greater than Abraham, not even Moses. Now read with me if you would, verse 7. But without any dispute, the less is blessed of the better. We're back to that first verse. Melchizedek is the better. He blessed the lesser, Abraham. But there's more to it. If y'all want some answers concerning verse 2 and 3, we'll certainly cover it. Look at verse 4. Now consider how great this man was, unto whom Abraham the patriarch gave a tenth out of his chief spoil. They indeed of the sons of Levi that received the priest office have commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law. That is, of their brethren, though these have come out of the loins of Abraham, he whose genealogy is not counted from them that have taken tithes of Abraham, and hath blessed him that hath the purpose. Without doubt, the less is blessed of the better. Here men that die receive tithes, but they're one of whom it is witnessed that he liveth. And so to say, through Abraham, even Levi, who hath received tithes, hath paid tithes, for he was yet in the loins of his father, whom Melchizedek met him. What he just said. Well, I'm glad you're going to tell me. What he just said was this. Here's Melchizedek. Here's Abraham. Melchizedek is greater than Abraham because Abraham gave tithes to Melchizedek. But Levi, the priesthood of Levi, the Aaronic priesthood, he came out of the loins of Abraham. That means the Levi and his priesthood is the lesser of Abraham and the lesser of Melchizedek. So the first point he makes is that the priesthood of Melchizedek is superior to the Levitical priesthood because Levi gave tithes to him through his father's loins. Look now at verse 11. There is another reason why the Levitical priesthood must be removed, and that is because it is imperfect. The imperfection of the Levitical priesthood, verse 11. Now, if there was perfection through the Levitical priesthood, what further need was there that another priest should arise after the order of Melchizedek? You have a tremendous priesthood, Levi's priesthood, Aaron's priesthood. Levi came out a long time. That's the priesthood. But there's imperfection with it. Why is there imperfection? Because God said there's going to be a greater priesthood. Why would he say there's going to be a greater priesthood? Because the Levitical priesthood was inferior. Did not and was not able to do the job. It was imperfect. Trying to skip over today. In verses 13 through 17, he points out that Jesus did not come through the Levitical priesthood. And since he didn't come through the Levitical priesthood, for him to be priest, there had to be a change of the law. Thus, the old law is done away with, so the new law can be established. The major point, however, is in verse 11, that the Levitical priesthood is not perfect, else God would not say and make the point that there is a priesthood coming. Looking now at verse 20, Jesus is a priest forever. Skipping a few things, the parenthetical statement of verse 21, for they indeed have made priests without an oath, but he with an oath by him that saith of him, the Lord swear and will not repent himself, thou art a priest forever. Do you not see that within the, I think you do, once I articulate it and you reread it, and you hear it, that God just said that the Melchizedek priesthood he described he will not die. He will live forever. That's one of the problems in the intersection of the Levitical priesthood, because they died and another priest took his place, and he died and another took his place. That was not the superior priesthood after the arrangement of Melchizedek. But God is saying, and I'm not through this point yet, thou art a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Thou art a priest forever, but not according to the Levitical priesthood. It's impossible. It couldn't happen. He goes on in verse 23. They indeed have been made priests, many in number. Why many in number? Because they died. Because that by death they are hindered from continuing. Verse 24, but he, in contrast, abideth forever. Wait a minute. What do you mean he abideth forever? God predicted it. Jesus, this one, was to abide forever. Looking now at verse 25, wherefore also he is able to save to the uttermost them that draw nigh to God through him, seeing he ever liveth to make intercession for them. Who is alive today for us? Jesus. Who was alive 100 years ago to intercede for them? Jesus. What about 1900 years ago? Jesus. He ever liveth. He never died. He abides forever. And God said that before Jesus was born. How many priests has God had since putting Jesus on the throne and as a priest of the Melchizedek priesthood? None. Why? Don't need him. He didn't die. But that's not true with the Levitical priesthood. We go further. Here's where we want to introduce the whole thing. Verse 7, chapter 7, verse 26. Jesus is flawed. And such a high priest became us, holy, guileless, undefiled, separated from sinners, made higher than the heaven. Let me stop you just a minute. Separated from sinners from the standpoint of not a sinner. Not separated from sinners because he's high-minded and won't stand around them, because he ate with them. Verse 27, who needeth not daily, like those high priests, to offer up sacrifices, first for his own sins, and then for the sins of the people. But this he did once for all, when he offered up himself. He's the priest. He offered up himself because he was sinless and could, and he was the priest, and he was the sacrifice. He did not offer the sacrifice for himself. He was the sacrifice, and it was for the people. A priest of God under the Levitical priesthood had to offer sacrifices for his own sins first. So the Levitical priesthood is flawed, is not perfect. But the priesthood of Christ is flawless. Verse 28. Been hurrying to get to this point. We notice. For the law appointeth men high priests having infirmity, but the word of the old. Psalm 110. Psalm 110. You need to follow the time frame. But the word of the old, which was after the law, appointeth a son, perfected forevermore. Here's what I'd like for you to do. Let me fill in some information. I guess view-wise, I need to do it this way. You start with Melchizedek. Sometime around 2000 BC. Sometime around 2000 BC. Abraham was there. Abraham gave tithe to the greater. About 500 years later, 1500 BC, the law of Moses was given. And the Levitical priesthood came into being for the first time ever, had never existed before. 500 years later, David said, "Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." 500 years after God set up the Levitical priesthood, at this time he set up the Levitical priesthood, he knew at this time it was not going to be what it needed to be, that there had to be a priesthood where that priest lived forever. Whenever Abraham gave tithes unto Melchizedek, and Melchizedek around 2000 BC was taking tithes from Abraham. God said, "Let me tell you about Melchizedek. I want you to do this, if you would, mentally. Go into every book in every library in the world. If it's not connected with the Bible, does any one of them talk about Melchizedek? No. When you take up the Bible, the book of Genesis, you have three books, I should say, in the Bible that discuss Melchizedek. Why did God even bring up Melchizedek? Do you know anything about Melchizedek? Do you have his history? No. He is one of a kind. He is unique. But God included him in the book of Genesis so that when we read concerning what Paul is writing, so that when we read what David wrote, we see the only all-knowing mind to put that together like this. You would never think to be able to do what God did. Your mind would never, ever contemplate what God did. Whenever the Jews read Psalm 110 and Genesis chapter 2, Genesis chapter 13, they never put those things together the way God did. And when Paul gets to the book of Hebrews, he brings it out to everybody what God meant when he even put Melchizedek in history. Historical writing. He now knows what God meant in Psalm 110. Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Who's Melchizedek? Read Genesis. He is a superior, and this is all you know about him from the Jews. He is a superior one over Abraham, over Levi. And Paul makes use of that in Hebrews because he wants the Hebrews to know. Don't go back to Judaism. It is inferior. It is inferior because Jesus is superior to the prophets. Jesus is superior to the angels. Jesus is superior to the lawgiver Moses. And Jesus is superior to Levi and the Levitical priesthood. And God told you this centuries before it occurred. Only God could do such a thing as that. I don't have time, but I'm going to do it anyway very quickly. Even though the Melchizedek priesthood is such a superior way of doing things, the Mormons teach that they have restored the Levitical priesthood in 1829. I'm reading from them. In a series of letters published in 1834, Oliver Pottery recorded the earliest detailed account of the appearance of John the Baptist to Oliver and Joseph Smith in 1829 at Harmony, Pennsylvania. The two men testified that they knelt before the angel who said, "Upon you, my fellow servants, in the name of the Messiah, I confer the priesthood of Aaron." Do you know how? Anybody want to add the word to that? I had a good friend. He would use the word asinine pretty often. And in reality, whenever the Mormon church said that God had restored in 1829 AD the Levitical Aaronic priesthood, that is about as dumb as you can get. And that shows you that the Book of Mormon is not from God, among other things. They take away the Lord's priesthood of believers, which is for all Christians, replace it with a priesthood only for white males. Since its origin, because of popular pressure in connection with this doctrine, their leaders received a new revelation instructing them to change their teaching to include non-whites. You can now be a Negro and you can be a priest in Mormonism. But that only occurred in the last century. Christianity does not have a priesthood of one order and a high priest of a different order. A high priest of Melchizedek and a priesthood of Aaron. Leviticus. 1 Peter 2, verse 9. 1 Peter 2, verse 9. Almost in. Christians were given the right to offer sacrifices to God through Christ. No priest stands between the Christian and the offering he has to give. But ye are an elect race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, that you may show forth the excellencies of him that called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. A number of decades ago, a young lady, a member of the church, called me on the phone. And in the conversation, she said, Ron, I need you to pray for me. Now, I was not trying to talk her out of me praying for her. But I want every Christian to know, you don't need a priest between you and God. You don't need a priest between you and God. You can go to God and you can pray to God. In 1 Peter 2, verse 5, you also as living stones will build up a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Hebrews 13:15. Philippians 4. Romans chapter 20.